Most people don't realize it, but there's a quiet war unfolding inside them every single day, a war between who they truly are and the version of themselves they believe the world will accept. It shows up in small moments, when you overthink a text before sending it, when you feel the need to explain why you've been quiet, when you justify your boundaries as if they need a stamp of approval. It feels normal, even kind, but underneath it all is something deeper, a fear that if you stop explaining yourself, you'll be misunderstood, judged, maybe even abandoned. So you keep talking, you keep softening, and little by little, your inner voice starts to fade. But the Stoics knew better. You don't need to debate it, defend it, or dress it up to make it palatable. You just need to live it. And once you stop explaining yourself, once you learn to sit in your silence with integrity, something powerful shifts. You stop performing and start becoming. If this resonates with you, if you're walking the path of reclaiming your inner authority and building a life rooted in self-respect and stillness, then please subscribe for yourself. Because every choice toward clarity is a step toward the person you were meant to be. It starts in moments so small, most people never notice. You speak your mind, you show emotion, maybe you cry, maybe you get angry, and someone, a parent, a teacher, a friend, tells you you're being dramatic or too sensitive, or they laugh like it's not serious, and in that instant, something sacred gets chipped away. You don't forget it, even if you tell yourself you have, because your nervous system remembers what your mind tries to bury. You learn early that expressing yourself comes with a risk, so you adapt, not because you want to lie, but because you want to stay safe. You want to stay connected, so you start reshaping your emotions into things that look more acceptable. You water them down, you wrap them in disclaimers, you explain your sadness as stress, your distance as tiredness, your anger as concern. And it works, a little. People respond better. They don't get defensive. They don't leave. But what you don't notice at first is the cost, a subtle daily self-erasure. You begin to believe that your truth is only valid if it makes sense to someone else. You think you're being thoughtful, respectful, but really, you're training yourself to mistrust your own experience. You stop asking yourself, is this true for me? And start asking, will they understand this if I say it? Over time, that shift rewires everything, because when truth needs a translator, authenticity slowly dies. This habit doesn't announce itself loudly. It hides in politeness, in the way you text 3 extra lines to justify why you're unavailable, in the way you overthink a boundary before saying it, in how you rush to explain your silence, your absence, your moods, not because anyone asked, but because you're terrified of being misunderstood. It becomes second nature, like flinching before impact. You start to believe it's part of being a good person, but it's not empathy. It's fear wearing empathy's clothes. It's a learned defense, born not out of care, but out of early invalidation. And the more you practice it, the more you become disconnected from your own center. What once felt real now feels confusing. You can't tell anymore if your emotions are yours or someone else's projections. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But how do you become anything when everything inside you has to pass through a filter before it's allowed out? When even your sadness needs to be softened, when your joy needs a reason, when your opinions need to be wrapped in disclaimers so no one takes them the wrong way. That's not freedom, that's performance. You're not connecting, you're managing perception, and every time you do it, you're quietly telling yourself that your raw truth isn't good enough, that it has to be fixed, edited, polished, before it's safe to share. And that belief eats away at you from the inside. You start to anticipate rejection before it even happens. You live in defense mode, and what you lose in the process is something you can't buy back, your own voice. And here's the part that stings. No one else can break this cycle for you. Because the people you're trying to please might not even notice the effort you're putting in. They may have never asked you to explain yourself in the first place, or worse, they've grown so used to it, they expect it. You've taught them that your comfort comes second to their understanding. You've taught yourself that harmony matters more than honesty, that connection is more important than clarity. But that's a lie, because real connection doesn't require self-erasure. Real love doesn't need a disclaimer. Real understanding doesn't come from over-explaining. It comes from presence, from stillness, from showing up without needing to prove anything. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment." When you over-explain, you've already decided that misunderstanding is the enemy. You've made peace into a performance. But what if you didn't? What if you let someone misunderstand you, and you didn't flinch? What if you didn't chase closure? What if you didn't justify your no? What if your emotions didn't come with an essay? It takes courage to unlearn this. To sit in silence after a boundary without sending a follow-up message. To say how you feel without offering a footnote. To walk away without a closing argument. But this is the beginning of something deeper. Something that can't exist when you're constantly asking the world for permission to be who you are. Epictetus taught that no one is free who is not master of themselves. And you cannot master yourself if you're always outsourcing your truth for approval. Freedom begins in the moment you stop translating yourself for others and begin trusting yourself completely. Not blindly, not arrogantly, but fully, without edits, without rehearsals, without apology. There's a reason your voice starts to tremble when you're trying to explain how you feel. Why your stomach tightens when you set a boundary, even gently. Why you feel the need to give 3 reasons instead of 1. It's not just about being clear or respectful. That's what we tell ourselves. But underneath the words, beneath the carefully chosen tone and the nervous smile, there's something older, something more raw. It's fear. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that lives quietly in the background of every conversation. Fear that if you don't explain yourself well enough, they'll get it wrong. They'll think less of you, walk away, misunderstand you, judge you, and maybe, just maybe, leave you standing there alone, wondering what part of you wasn't enough to be accepted. So you try to manage it by making yourself more understandable, more agreeable, more soft, more safe. Because deep down, the fear isn't just that you'll be misunderstood. It's that if someone doesn't understand you, they'll stop caring. And if they stop caring, you'll be alone. That's why so many people spend their lives walking on eggshells with their own truth, not because they're weak, but because somewhere along the way they learned that safety is conditional. That love, attention, even basic respect depends on being easy to digest. It doesn't matter how emotionally intelligent you are or how much you've grown, this fear hides itself inside your nervous system, built from experiences you barely remember, but never fully healed from. You were probably just a child the first time you were told your emotions were too much, or your silence was a problem, or your honesty made things worse. And from that moment, you learned, connection comes at the cost of self-expression. So now, years later, you edit yourself out of habit. You explain not to connect, but to protect. Because maybe if they just understand you better, they won't walk away. Maybe if they get your side, you won't lose them. But think about that for a moment. If someone only stays because you've convinced them, do they really see you? Or just the version of you you've created for their comfort? Seneca once wrote, "It is not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It is because we do not dare that things are difficult." And the same goes for truth. You don't explain yourself because it's necessary. You explain yourself because you're afraid to risk being unfiltered. And that fear is what makes life more complicated than it needs to be. Because every time you reach for words to make someone stay, you're reinforcing the belief that your presence isn't enough on its own, that who you are, unedited, unframed, might be too much, or not enough. So you speak to cover the silence. You explain to soften the blow. You talk, not to be heard, but to prevent rejection. But here's what you might not see yet. This constant explaining isn't protecting you. It's keeping you small. It's keeping you invisible in all the ways that matter. It convinces you that love is something to be earned through justification rather than something to be lived in through presence. You're not building intimacy, you're building walls with transparent bricks. And one day, you look around and realize that all the people in your life only know the filtered version of you. The you who's always careful, always reasonable, always trying not to rock the boat. And you wonder why you feel alone, even when you're surrounded by others. Carl Jung warned that the greatest danger to the soul is living according to others' expectations. He said, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." This doesn't mean you have to shut the world out or become unkind. It means you stop translating yourself to be understood and start living from the center of your own being. And yes, it's risky. Yes, you might be misunderstood. Some people might even walk away. But that's not loss, that's clarity. Because when you stop explaining yourself, you stop negotiating your worth. And this clarity is worth more than the illusion of safety, because it gives you something no explanation ever could. The ability to belong to yourself first, the courage to stand in silence when your truth is enough, the strength to let someone misunderstand you without scrambling to fix it, the integrity to live aligned, even if it makes others uncomfortable. Aristotle once said, "To avoid criticism, say nothing, do nothing, be nothing." But that's not living, that's disappearing. So here's the real question. Would you rather be accepted for a version of you that's easy to understand, or respected for the person you truly are, even when it's uncomfortable? You don't need to explain your soul to anyone, and the people who are meant to walk with you, they won't need you to. They'll recognize the truth in your presence, not just your words. And if they don't, let them misunderstand. You are not responsible for someone else's ability to receive your truth. You are only responsible for living it, fully, quietly, unapologetically. There's a point where it doesn't feel like over-explaining anymore. It just feels normal. You start editing your words before they even leave your mouth. You pre-package your thoughts so they land softly, so they don't offend, so they don't make things harder for anyone else. And every time you do it, a small part of your own voice goes silent. It doesn't scream. It just fades. It gets quieter. Doubt creeps in where certainty once lived. You feel something deeply but question if it's valid. You start to second-guess not just how you express your emotions, but whether you should feel them in the first place. You apologize for taking up space. You hesitate before expressing a boundary as if your well-being needs a reason. And slowly, your sense of self, that inner compass you were born with, begins to distort. You stop trusting your instincts. You hesitate in moments that once felt clear. You ask for permission to feel what you already know is real. What's frightening is how socially acceptable this erosion becomes. People praise you for being easygoing, for being chill, for not making a fuss, for being mature enough to understand both sides. And you wear it like a badge, even as it wears you down. You tell yourself you're being rational, thoughtful, but deep down there's a whisper. You're not living, you're performing, not for applause, but for belonging, for peace, for protection. What started as caution becomes identity, and you forget what your unfiltered voice even sounds like. You can't tell the difference between people-pleasing and kindness anymore. You confuse obedience for emotional intelligence. But your body knows the truth. It tenses when you say yes, even though you meant no. It flinches when you're asked how you feel, because you've trained yourself to answer what's expected, not what's true. This is what happens when you disconnect from yourself. It doesn't come with alarms or red flags. It comes in the form of small betrayals, the kind that add up over years. Smiling when you're not okay, laughing when you're uncomfortable, saying, "I understand," when you actually feel disappointed. You live in fragments, parts of yourself shown, parts hidden, depending on who you're with. And then one day, you wake up and realize you don't even know what's real anymore. What you actually want, what you truly believe. Because every thought you've had in recent memory was shaped by how it would be received. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And that's the quiet tragedy of over-explaining. It's not just about being understood, it's about being acceptable. You curate yourself, one sentence at a time, to avoid rejection. You reduce yourself into a version that won't be questioned or judged or pushed away. But in doing so, you also push away your truth. And you can't have clarity while denying your core. You can't move forward when every step is made to please others. Life becomes a tightrope. You lose spontaneity. You hesitate before speaking, and that hesitation becomes your default. You wonder why you're exhausted, why small conversations feel like emotional labor, why being around others sometimes drains you more than silence ever could. It's not because you're broken, it's because you've disconnected, not from the world, from yourself. And the longer you live in that space, the harder it becomes to return to your center. Because silence becomes scary. Stillness becomes uncomfortable. You get so used to shaping your words for others that you start doing it even in your own head. Even your inner dialogue begins to judge. You correct your thoughts before they've even finished forming. You start negotiating your own boundaries internally before anyone else even pushes back. And all of this happens quietly, without drama, without crisis. That's what makes it so dangerous. It looks like calm, but it's actually detachment from your values, your voice, your truth. Marcus Aurelius said, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." And when your thoughts are constantly filtered through the lens of approval, your soul dims. Not because you're weak, but because you've been rewired to think survival means submission. But it doesn't. Survival means clarity, alignment, coherence, and that only begins when you stop betraying yourself in small daily ways. When you let your truth speak before it's edited. When you feel something and allow it to exist without needing it to make sense to anyone else. That's when your voice starts returning. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, sure, unapologetic. And the people who were only comfortable with the quieter version of you, the edited version, might drift. That's okay. Let them. Because they were never really close to you. They were close to your mask. And masks don't build relationships. They build performances. But the ones who see you, even when you're messy, even when you say no, even when you stop apologizing for being tired or quiet or honest, those are the ones worth keeping. Because they don't need you to audition, they just need you to show up, as you are, fully. And when that becomes your new normal, the disconnection begins to heal, and you finally remember what it feels like to be whole. Explaining yourself often feels like safety. You imagine that if you can just find the right words, if you phrase your thoughts carefully enough, they'll get it. They won't be angry. They won't misunderstand you. They won't leave. So you explain. You over-explain. You try to be fair, reasonable, measured. You rehearse conversations in your head before they happen. You craft messages, then rewrite them to make sure they won't trigger a reaction. And somewhere in that process, you convince yourself that you're in control, that if you manage their perception well enough, you can keep the connection, avoid the judgment, soften the blow. But what you're really doing isn't creating peace. It's managing anxiety. It's trying to secure a response you can never fully control. Because no matter how carefully you speak, people will still hear you through the filter of their own expectations, fears, and assumptions. And that's the trap. You believe you're being honest, but you're only sharing the parts of your truth that feel safest to reveal. You think you're building understanding, but you're actually negotiating. Not in the healthy sense of mutual compromise, but in the subtle act of sacrificing your authenticity for the comfort of others. You shape your truth to fit the room, to reduce conflict, to make yourself easier to love or at least harder to reject. But the price of that adjustment adds up over time. It costs you clarity, confidence, identity, because every time you edit your reality to avoid discomfort, you reinforce the belief that your unfiltered self isn't acceptable. And the paradox is, the more you try to control what others see, the more out of control you feel inside. You become hyper-aware of reactions. You overanalyze silences. You search for signs of rejection in expressions, tones, pauses. And when someone doesn't respond how you hoped, you blame yourself for not explaining it well enough. So you try again, you clarify, you elaborate, you defend. And each time you do, you lose a little more trust in your own perception. Your internal authority gets drowned out by the noise of external approval. The narrative becomes less about what's true for you and more about how to be accepted, how to be liked, how to be safe. But peace that comes at the expense of your own integrity is not peace, it's performance. It's emotional labor dressed up as communication. And what makes it dangerous is that it's rewarded. People often thank you for being so considerate, so thoughtful, so articulate. They like the version of you that never causes waves, that's always ready to explain and reassure. But it's not sustainable, because no matter how calm your tone or clear your words, you can't control someone else's interpretation. And trying to do so will only exhaust you. The more you chase understanding, the more you abandon your own need to simply be. Plato once said, "The measure of a man is what he does with power," and there's a kind of false power in explaining, the illusion that if you just try hard enough, you can steer the situation. But real power doesn't come from being understood. It comes from being grounded, from knowing what you stand for, even if it's misunderstood, from being able to say, "This is what I feel," without scrambling to prove it. Because when truth requires a disclaimer to feel legitimate, it's no longer truth, it's strategy. And life lived as strategy quickly becomes hollow. The connections you think you're preserving by explaining yourself endlessly often end up feeling more distant than honest silence ever would. Sooner or later, something inside you starts to resist. You begin to notice the emptiness in conversations where you're always the one making things easier. You feel the fatigue in your chest after justifying your needs, your emotions, your limits. And you start to see the moments where you twisted your words into something softer than what you meant. Not out of care, but out of fear. Fear that your truth might not be received well, that it might challenge someone, that it might be labeled as selfish, dramatic, cold, and so you shrink it again and again until you don't recognize what's yours anymore. Seneca warned that no man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself. And explaining, when done compulsively, becomes a way to avoid that adversity, a way to sidestep the discomfort of being misunderstood. But you don't grow by avoiding discomfort. You grow by walking through it, by holding your truth even when it shakes, even when the people around you don't applaud it, even when they challenge or misread it, because the point isn't to be liked, it's to be whole. And wholeness can't exist when every word is filtered through fear. Eventually, you realize that the need to explain is not about the other person understanding you, it's about you not yet fully trusting yourself. And that's where the work begins. Not with finding better words, but with finding the courage to stop needing them. Not with rehearsing your reasons, but with living your truth quietly and firmly. Because the more you let go of the illusion of control, the more power you reclaim over your own life. The kind of power that doesn't shout, it just stands. And that's the power that changes everything. There comes a point where the exhaustion outweighs the fear. Not all at once and not in a dramatic collapse, but gradually, like fog lifting after a long grey morning. You stop explaining yourself, not because you've mastered confidence, but because you're tired. Tired of rehearsing your truth just to make it sound digestible. Tired of defending your boundaries like you're on trial. Tired of shrinking your feelings into polite sentences that won't make anyone uncomfortable. So you stop. You don't say everything you used to say. You don't rush to respond to being misunderstood. You don't offer a soft landing to someone who's never once made space for your full self. And at first, it feels strange. The silence that follows is unfamiliar, not empty but echoing. A kind of stillness that confronts everything you used to run from. But then you notice something. The ground doesn't fall out from beneath you. The world doesn't collapse because you didn't explain. People who never really saw you begin to show their true colors. And the relationships that were built on your constant effort, those that depended on your willingness to explain, to smooth things over, to bridge the gap, start to feel oddly quiet. Not because something's broken, but because you've finally stopped feeding them. What once felt like connection reveals itself as dependency, and your silence becomes the great revealer. It shows you what was real and what was just a reflection of your effort to be accepted. And the most unexpected thing? You don't feel lost. You feel more like yourself than you have in years. Because that silence you feared for so long, the one you believed meant rejection, isolation, loss, begins to feel like home. Not the silence of shutting down, but the silence of no longer needing to perform. There's power in that, power in not answering every accusation, power in letting someone believe what they want while you stay rooted in your truth. You realize that not every misunderstanding is your responsibility to clear up. Not every misinterpretation deserves your time. Not every opinion needs to be corrected. And in that space, your nervous system finally takes a breath. Carl Jung once said, "Solitude is not necessarily about being alone, but being whole." And that's what this silence becomes. A return to wholeness. A moment when you stop measuring your value by how well you're understood. Because the truth is, some people never wanted to understand you. They just wanted you manageable, agreeable, predictable, and silence threatens that. Silence says, I am no longer available to be shaped by your perception. I don't need to fight you, but I will no longer bend. And the silence that once felt like retreat becomes your new form of resistance, gentle but unmovable. You begin to move differently. You pause before speaking, not because you're anxious, but because you've learned that silence holds more weight than scattered words. You leave conversations incomplete, not out of pride, but because your peace no longer requires wrapping everything in a bow. And the irony is, the more you honor your silence, the more clearly you start to hear yourself. Your intuition, once buried under the noise of over-explaining, begins to speak again. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It reminds you of your center, of your values, of what matters and what doesn't. And suddenly, all those situations where you used to beg to be understood now look like moments of self-abandonment you simply won't return to. There's a quiet shift that happens when you stop explaining. People start adjusting. Some distance themselves, some try harder to provoke a reaction, some accuse you of being cold, distant, arrogant. But you begin to see those accusations for what they are, projections from people who were never truly comfortable with your boundaries in the first place. And while it might hurt at first, you realize that your silence is doing something no explanation ever could. It's drawing a line between who you were when you needed approval and who you are now that you've remembered your worth. Epictetus once said, "If someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation." And that's what silence protects. It gives you a pause, a moment to check in, to choose your response instead of offering it on impulse. You start to see that staying centered is more important than being right. That inner clarity matters more than external agreement. And your life begins to shift around that truth. You stop attracting people who feed on your explanations. You begin to feel drawn toward those who honor your presence, not your performance. And for the first time, your relationships start to feel mutual. not because they're perfect, but because you're no longer negotiating your identity to keep them. That's what awakening looks like. Not some grand declaration, but a quiet decision to stop handing your truth to people who can't hold it. And as you sit with that silence, something returns. Not a version of you that was lost, but the self that was always waiting beneath the noise. Steady, whole, unapologetic. Not because you have something to prove, but because you no longer need to explain why you exist the way you do. At first, the silence feels like a personal shift. A subtle withdrawal from the compulsion to explain yourself. You're not trying to be different. You're just not bending the way you used to. You still care. You still show up. But you stop packaging your truth to make it easier for others to accept. And though nothing outwardly dramatic changes, the people around you begin to sense it. They can't quite name it, but they feel it. You've pulled back something they used to have access to, not your affection, not your presence, but your willingness to justify your existence. The quiet weight of your new boundaries begins to disturb the air, and those who relied on your constant self-editing start to feel unsettled. Some begin to push harder, not with violence or cruelty, but with subtle emotional tests, questions laced with guilt, long silences when you don't respond the way they expect, passive-aggressive remarks designed to pull you back into the old dance. But you don't bite. You hear them, but you don't rush to soften the tension. You feel the old instinct to explain rising, the reflex to fix their discomfort with your compliance, and you let it pass. That restraint, that stillness, becomes the loudest thing in the room. And people who once held unspoken control over your emotions begin to lose their grip, not because you fought them, but because you stopped playing the game. This isn't revenge, it's clarity. The collapse of control doesn't look like an explosion. It looks like you no longer flinching at disapproval. You no longer offering paragraphs for decisions that require no audience. You no longer adjusting your tone to make others feel okay about your boundaries. It looks like you choosing inner alignment over external approval, again and again. And slowly, what's false starts to fall away. The relationships that thrived on your guilt begin to wither in your silence. The friendships that needed you to stay small start to dissolve under the weight of your growth. And instead of trying to hold them together, you let them go, not with bitterness, but with peace, because something becomes crystal clear. Not everyone was drawn to your truth. Some were drawn to your self-betrayal. They admired your compassion when it meant putting them first. They loved your loyalty when it meant silencing your needs. They praised your emotional intelligence when it meant you always understood them and they never had to understand you. But that version of connection was never mutual. It was built on your silence, your sacrifice, your fear of losing love. And now that fear is gone, what remains are only the bonds that were real, the ones that don't need your submission to survive. Seneca once wrote, "As is a tale, so is life. Not how long it is, but how good it is what matters." And the same applies to relationships. The quality of connection has nothing to do with how long someone stays, and everything to do with who they are when you stop performing for them. When you stop making excuses for your boundaries, when you stop managing their emotions at the expense of your own. That's when the truth of the relationship is revealed. Some people step closer, drawn to the strength they always sensed in you. Others fade away, confused or offended by the version of you they can't control. Let them. Their exit is not a failure, it's a filter. And the ones who stay, who remain steady even when you don't explain, those are the ones who were never in it for your submission. They were in it for your soul. As the power dynamics crumble, you begin to see how much of your life was built on silent compromise. How many times you said yes when you meant no. How often you absorbed discomfort to protect someone else from feeling it. How deeply you learned to equate love with compliance. And now, in the absence of all that, a new form of power takes shape. Not the kind that dominates, the kind that simply doesn't move, that stays grounded in truth. That makes no apologies for existing. This shift might make you seem different, colder, harder, more distant. But in reality, you're just no longer available for manipulation. You're no longer training others to depend on your self-abandonment. And those who needed your guilt to keep their comfort will inevitably fall away. Let them. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect for your growth. The love you're building now doesn't demand your silence. It welcomes your truth. You stop trying to be understood by everyone because you finally understand yourself. And that understanding doesn't come from words. It comes from choosing silence when explanation would cost you your center, from choosing solitude over fake peace, from choosing alignment over approval. That's how control collapses. Not through war, but through stillness. Not with raised voices, but with quiet self-possession. And in that quiet, everything that was never real begins to fall away, leaving behind only what was meant to stay. There comes a moment in your silence where something deeper begins to take root. Not just the absence of noise, but the arrival of clarity. You stop seeking permission to feel what you feel. You stop rehearsing justifications for your peace. What starts to emerge isn't pride or defiance, it's authority. But not the kind others grant you, it's the kind you grant yourself. The quiet realization that you do not need to decorate your truth with disclaimers. That you can live from the inside out, not as a reaction to the world, but as a steady reflection of who you are when you're not explaining, adjusting, or performing. It doesn't come with fireworks, it comes with calm. You begin to say things like, "No, thank you," and you don't flinch at the silence that follows. You say, "This isn't for me," and you don't rush to clarify why. You feel a boundary rising from within you, and instead of asking whether it will make others uncomfortable, you honor it. That's what internal authority looks like. It's not aggressive, it doesn't dominate, but it also doesn't waver. It stands in its own presence. It breathes in alignment. It refuses to shapeshift, to avoid misunderstanding, and it doesn't crumble under the weight of someone else's disappointment. Carl Jung described this as individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating all the fragments you've split off in order to be accepted, the anger you repressed to seem kind, the boundaries you dissolved to appear loving, the opinions you swallowed so you wouldn't be labeled difficult. All of it slowly returns to you, and you realize none of it was ever wrong. It was just inconvenient to others, but to reclaim it, to gather those scattered pieces and stand in them without apology, is to begin the long inward journey towards self-respect. Not the kind that shouts, "I don't care," but the kind that doesn't need to say anything at all. You don't wake up one day fully confident. That's not how it works. What happens instead is a series of small, personal victories. The moment you don't chase after someone who misunderstood you. The moment you sit with your discomfort instead of explaining it away. The moment you let someone else be wrong about you and don't rush in to correct them. Each of those moments becomes a brick in the foundation of your authority. And over time, you feel it rising in your body, not as tension, but as presence, not as defense, but as direction. Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." And knowing yourself means being willing to let go of who you were taught to be. It means recognizing that your life is not a negotiation with the world, but a relationship with your own conscience. And in that relationship, your voice matters most. When you trust it, when you listen, you begin to live not in response to fear or guilt, but from a grounded sense of truth. A truth that doesn't need to be argued. A truth that simply is. This kind of authority isn't about having all the answers. It's about being rooted enough to stop asking others what your value is. You stop seeking mirrors. You stop outsourcing your validation. You stop needing to prove that your feelings are reasonable. Instead, you move through the world with a quiet steadiness. You don't broadcast your boundaries. You live them. You don't announce your growth. You embody it. And that embodiment shifts everything: the way people speak to you, the way they respond to your energy, the way they begin to either respect your presence or remove themselves from it. Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free." And there is nothing braver than standing in your truth without needing it to be softened or approved. That freedom doesn't mean you won't feel fear. It means fear won't lead. It means your truth takes the wheel, calmly, clearly, without detour. That's how internal authority moves. It doesn't yell. It doesn't convince. It doesn't defend itself against every misunderstanding. It knows who it is. It knows what matters, and it lets the rest fall where it may. This shift may cause discomfort. It may threaten dynamics that were built on your compliance. But what it gives you in return is beyond measure. A self that no longer trembles under someone else's gaze. A self that no longer asks, "Will they approve?" before making a move. A self that belongs, not because it was allowed in, but because it stopped asking for entry. And from that self, you begin to build a life, one not shaped by external expectations, but sculpted by your own hands, quietly, patiently, truthfully. Because once internal authority is born, it doesn't fade. It matures, it roots deeper, and eventually it becomes the voice you trust above all others, the one that never needed to be explained, only remembered. There's a moment when everything quiets, not just on the outside, but deep within. Something real takes root. You're no longer walking into rooms seeking approval, calculating how to be received, adjusting your tone like a dial just to keep things smooth. You don't explain anymore, you just are. The shift doesn't look like rebellion, it feels like peace. You're not asking for space. You're claiming it without taking anything from anyone. Your presence stops apologizing, and without needing to announce it, something begins to change around you. People feel it. They can't always explain it, but they notice. Your energy, once wrapped in hesitation, now feels unmistakably certain. You don't demand attention, but you command respect, not through volume, but through stillness. And this is where the magnetism begins. Not the performative kind that seeks to impress, the grounded kind that says, "I know who I am, and I'm not leaving myself to meet you." That kind of presence has weight. It doesn't chase, it doesn't convince, it radiates, and those who can't handle that energy either step back or attempt to pull you down. But you don't shrink anymore. You don't mold your edges into softness just to make others feel taller. You don't fold yourself to fit someone else's version of acceptable. You stay expanded, not to dominate, but to stop dimming the truth of who you are. Carl Jung believed that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration. And that's what begins to unfold: integration. All the parts you exiled because they were too much, all the instincts you buried because they made others uncomfortable, they come back, not as noise, but as clarity. And suddenly, your boundaries don't need defending. They're not up for debate. They're lived. Your decisions don't come with explanations. They don't ask for agreement. They arrive with a quiet finality that needs no commentary. And in this way, you begin to rewrite the terms of your relationships, not through arguments or ultimatums, but through energy, through who you've become. It's subtle, but undeniable. People who were once used to access emotional, mental, physical, feel the absence of your old self, not because you disappeared, but because the version of you they leaned on no longer answers the door. And the ones who truly see you won't feel threatened. They'll feel relieved, because when someone stops negotiating their worth, they stop draining the people around them for validation. The dynamic levels out. It becomes clean, honest, mutual. But anyone who was drawn to your self-doubt, to your habit of over-explaining, to your need to be understood before you felt worthy, they'll begin to drift. They might resist it at first, try to provoke the old patterns, but when you don't bite, when you don't explain, when you let them think what they want and still remain at peace, the illusion breaks. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own. And that's what you've left behind, that imbalance. You no longer live to be perceived correctly. You live to be true, not perfect, just real. And that realness is magnetic, not because it's glamorous, but because it's rare. In a world full of masks and performance, there's something deeply attractive about someone who doesn't flinch under the weight of being misunderstood. Someone who isn't constantly managing perception, but simply existing in alignment. And that's what people feel when they meet you now, alignment. Even if they don't agree with you, they respect the coherence, the consistency between what you say and how you live. There's no scramble to please, no eagerness to be liked, just a quiet invitation. This is who I am, take it or leave it. And that's not arrogance, it's self-respect. It's what happens when you finally stopped explaining yourself, not out of defensiveness, but because you no longer believe your existence needs a justification. And that belief, once it lands in your bones, shifts everything. You begin to notice how differently the world reacts to someone who moves without chasing, how the conversations change when you stop filling every silence with an apology, how the decisions become easier when they no longer require consensus. And the beauty of it is, you're not doing any of this to prove a point. You're doing it because you finally remembered what it feels like to be whole, to stand in your own skin and not ask the room if it's okay. Plato said, "The first and greatest victory is to conquer yourself." And that victory isn't about force, it's about return. Returning to the self that always existed beneath the performance. The self that didn't need to explain every emotion to be allowed to feel it. The self that didn't need to narrate every boundary to believe it was valid. The self that isn't waiting for permission anymore. And when you live from that place, when you stop explaining not out of silence but from truth, you become magnetic in a way that doesn't need attention. You become steady in a way that doesn't flinch under pressure, and you begin to realize something. All that explaining you used to do wasn't about being heard. It was about trying to earn the right to be. But you've already earned that, by being. And now that you know it, there's nothing left to explain. You don't need to explain who you are to be worthy of peace. You don't need to justify your presence to deserve respect. The moment you stop asking for permission to exist is the moment everything changes. Not because the world gave you space, but because you finally claimed your own. If this spoke to something inside you, watch the next video on your screen. Your journey isn't finished yet. And thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal. Stay grounded, stay true.